Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, wherever you are. You are joining PilieroMazza's webinar today regarding strategies to mitigate aggressive OFCCP enforcement. My name is Sara Nasseri. I'm an attorney in the Labor and Employment Practice Group at PilieroMazza, and there's a lot going on in the OFCCP, so I know as folks are starting to roll in here, I'm just going to go through some intro slides and hopefully gives folks some time to join in. So again, my name is Sara Nasseri. I am a labor and employment attorney. We, do a lot in our practice group, focused on government contractors and commercial private sector clients, and we essentially advise on a range of workplace-related matters with a focus on legal and regulatory compliance. So anything from, drafting policies, reviewing policies, agreements, overall best practices, all that good stuff. Obviously, a lot going on with the OFCCP that we'll talk about. So I've been doing my fair share of OFCCP work at the moment as well. About PilieroMazza itself, for those of you who may not know, we are a business law firm. We serve to government contractors and commercial businesses. There's a whole list of practice areas and practice groups that we have, and the list is there. I won't necessarily read off all of them, but you can see anything from government contracts, protests, all the way to obviously labor and employment, litigation, and also mergers and acquisitions and business transactions. So we do a lot here. So if you have any questions or need any assistance, feel free to reach out. Okay, so just looking at the attendees list, I think we're good to go to get started here. Just as a reminder, this webinar will be recorded, and towards the end of the presentation, I will also be providing folks with the HRCI program ID number, which should give some credit for those who may want it. And then also all attendees will be receiving a follow-up email with a link to the recording with my contact info as well. So I am going to do my best to look at questions throughout the presentation. Kind of hard for me to multitask and do two things at once sometimes, but I will certainly do my best and answer as many as I can, but to the extent I cannot, those questions will be provided to me, and I'm happy to, reach out directly and discuss any questions that you may have. So pop those questions in. Again, I will either do my best to answer them throughout the presentation, or again, I can just follow up with each person individually after the fact. So great. So just to get started, hopefully for those who are joining, you obviously join because you know what the OFCCP is and who the agency is specifically, but just as a quick primer, the OFCCP is the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Program. They are a subdivision of the U.S. Department of Labor. They are responsible for ensuring that employers who do business with the federal government, so federal contractors, are responsible for complying with various laws and regulations regarding non-discrimination, affirmative action, and so forth. So for many of you who know the OFCCP, you obviously know sort of the scope of their authority and their enforcement, but they're basically sort of a parallel to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is the EEOC. So the EEOC works primarily with private employers, right? And they are responsible for enforcing Title VII and all those specific laws. But the OFCCP is essentially focused on the same sort of mission, but they are responsible for the government contractor space and federal contractors specifically. So that's the OFCCP. So I assume that most, if not all, of those attending here today are work for a government contractor, or obviously are or have that sort of section of their business that they do work with that obviously will fall under the jurisdiction of the OFCCP. Here's the mission statement of the OFCCP. I always like to just sort of recite this because I think it's pretty important that folks understand what the OFCCP intends to do, right? What their purpose is, what their goal is, because I think it gives you a better understanding of sort of how it ties into their enforcement mechanisms and sort of the authority that they have. So essentially, straight from their website, right? They say, we are here to protect workers, promote diversity, and enforce the law. We hold those who do business with the federal government, that includes contractors and subcontractors, responsible for complying with the legal requirement to take affirmative action and not discriminate on the basis of race, color, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, national origin, disability, or status as a protected veteran. In addition, contractors and subcontractors are prohibited from discharging or otherwise discriminating against applicants or employees who inquire about, discuss, or disclose their compensation or that of others. So I think that, obviously this is pretty self-explanatory. I would focus on those protected classes that they list there. So you'll note that there is specifically sexual orientation, gender identity, status as a protected veteran, right? Those are, well, at least sexual orientation, gender identity used to be unique to the OFCCP, but now after a monumental Supreme Court case a couple years ago, that is also now enforceable under Title VII. But status as a protected veteran, that's obviously a little bit different than you see otherwise. And then also that last piece about compensation, we'll talk a little bit about this new directive that the OFCCP has issued with regard to pay equity. And compensation, for sure, is going to be a primary focus of the agency during this administration. And folks will be seeing a lot coming from the OFCCP as far as enforcement with regard to compensation. So that's the mission statement, and that sort of gives you an idea of sort of what foundational principle the agency is based upon. So who's leading the OFCCP? So I'm sure many of you know, with every administration change and every new presidency, there is also a new director at the OFCCP. So a lot of agencies, obviously, once a new administration comes in, leadership changes, and the same goes for the OFCCP. So under the Trump administration, there was a prior director. His name was Craig Lean. He had his own, unique sort of focuses and things that he specifically was concerned about, and obviously transcended to the things that the agency did during that time. But with the incoming presidency and Joe Biden taking office, we have a new director by the name of Jenny Yang. So who is Jenny Yang? She was formerly a plaintiff's attorney. She was then appointed to the chair of the EEOC, so again, that sort of parallel agency, before coming to the OFCCP. So obviously she has a lot of experience with sort of these non-discrimination obligations and ensuring that employers are taking action and not discriminating against individuals based on those protected categories. It's, I think, noteworthy that she was also formerly a plaintiff's attorney, because I think obviously that gives sort of the understanding that she comes in with a very worker-friendly, employee-friendly type of outlook and perspective. So obviously with her background, we anticipated and are seeing a lot of great activity from the OFCCP surrounding more sort of employee worker-friendly objectives and sort of more enforcement on the contractor community and ensuring that they are taking these non-discrimination obligations seriously. So another sort of noteworthy point here is that during her time at the EEOC, she's actually the one that spearheaded the movement to disclose pay data on those tedious EEO1 reports. So if you all recall, there was a whole sort of litigation that finally ensued surrounding disclosing compensation data or so-called component 2 data on company EEO1 reports. That's sort of still in limbo, and it hasn't really moved forward, but she was a very big and crucial part, or played a very big and crucial part in moving that forward. So with that in mind, you know, it's clear, and many folks sort of anticipated when she came and took the position that she would have a very high focus on pay equity and compensation discrimination. And based on a few actions and then the directive that was issued just a few months ago, we can certainly say that is actually indeed the case. So be on the outlook for, you know, major focuses on compensation discrimination, you know, if and when you do get called in for an OFCCP audit. So the 3 EO laws that the OFCCP administers, Executive Order 11246, so this essentially establishes the requirements for non-discriminatory practices in hiring and employment. It's specific to women and minorities. Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, or better just known as Section 503, this requires affirmative action and prohibits employment discrimination specific to individuals with disability. There is a contract monetary threshold for each of these laws, and we'll talk about it in the next slide. But it's important to understand, depending on the contract values that you have, the federal contracts, and the number of employees you have, sort of your obligations will start to differ based on each of those. So you want to make sure that you have an understanding of where exactly you fall and exactly what obligations and requirements you're supposed to meet. And the last one is the Vietnam Era Veterans Readjustment Assistance Act of 1974, or better known as VEVRAA. And this was essentially enacted to protect returning veterans from the Vietnam War from discrimination, but now it covers a more broad scope of quote unquote protected veterans, which essentially includes all veterans. So as we'll talk a little bit more down the line, you know, Section 503, VEVRAA, Executive Order 11246, essentially are the laws that ensure that federal contractors are taking affirmative action and ensuring that they're not discriminating against individuals in all those protected categories, right? So women, minorities, individuals with disabilities, and veterans. So this is the scope of authority that the OFCCP has, and these are the 3 laws that are critical to that enforcement policy. So here's that jurisdictional threshold sort of chart that I was talking about. I don't need to really dive too much into detail here, as I will say that the OFCCP itself and its website is actually a great resource. I mean, that's one thing that they do relatively well, is they do try to provide as much guidance as possible. I mean, albeit, you know, sometimes it's not very clear and not very helpful, but they do make an effort to provide these things for the contractor community to sort of make it a little bit easier as far as what their expectations are and sort of what obligations are required. So really quickly on the left here, you'll just see each of those laws and then the sort of levels and monetary thresholds which are implicated under each law. So under Executive Order 11246, basically any number of employees and contracts valued at $10,000 or more, which is a very low threshold, and probably 90 or the majority of contractors are going to fall within that threshold. But if you meet that basic $10,000 minimum, you are subject to EO 11246. So you are required to meet the most basic affirmative action obligations. Now, when things kick in at 50 employees and $50,000 or more are when you have your obligation to develop an affirmative action plan. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a little bit, because there is now that new certification requirement that actually requires certification by the end of this month. So you'll see the same with Section 503, and then again with regard to VEVRAA. The monetary thresholds are, you know, change a little bit with Section 503 and then also with VEVRAA. But take a look at it, refer to it. It's available on the OFCCP website, but this is really good for folks who are government contractors or who work for government contractors to understand, just so you know where your obligations are and what exactly is expected and required of you, because it does change depending on your number of employees and then also the contracts that you hold. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about recent developments. So, obviously based on the title of this webinar, there is a lot of growing activism coming from the OFCCP, a lot of activity that's obviously signaling sort of this new era of stricter enforcement. And I wouldn't necessarily say new, I would just say probably a change of pace from the prior administration and from the prior agency, right? So as I mentioned, under the Trump administration, Director Craig Lean was sort of focused on, his personal agenda and then sort of his various things. But then one of the big sort of takeaways from his leadership was this sort of attempt and aim and goal to try to increase sort of clarity and transparency and communication with the contractor community. We saw some sort of flexibility surrounding when contractors could respond to audits and things like that. We're seeing a much different posture now from the OFCCP, which is again not necessarily unexpected, but it's happening a lot faster than we anticipated and a lot more, I guess, strict than we anticipated, at least to start. So one of the biggest things that came, or I shouldn't say came from this new leadership, but is now being launched under this new leadership, is the AAP certification portal. So for those of you who probably know and who are, in that sort of bigger contractor size, right? So 50 or more employees, you're familiar with the obligation to develop and maintain an affirmative action program, right? Or an AAP. So that's not changed. That has always been an obligation since the laws were enacted, and contractors always had the obligation to develop and maintain an AAP. The issue that the OFCCP sort of began to realize was that many contractors weren't necessarily developing and maintaining their AAP on an annual basis like they were required to do. And unless you were called in for an audit and you received one of those, not very fun scheduling letters notifying that you were indeed up for an audit, the OFCCP sort of had no way to confirm whether or not a contractor who was required to develop and maintain an AAP was in fact doing so. So in sort of 2018 or so, there began these sort of initiatives where the OFCCP was sort of taking action to ensure that the contractors were in fact developing these AAPs, and it wasn't until, I believe, December 2021 that the OFCCP actually launched its AAP verification interface. So this page sort of was just around on their website, if anyone remembers. I mean, for a good couple months and almost a year, it was just a landing page, and it said AAP verification portal, and it just was basically, and had an under construction label stuck on it, and it was just sitting there for quite some time until February 1st, 2022, when the agency finally launched its online portal, and that's essentially when the clock began ticking for covered contractors and subcontractors to certify by the June 30th deadline. So beginning on February 1st, registration for the portal sort of opened up. So if you were subject to the AAP requirement, you could go into the portal, register, sort of do all the administrative things that you needed to do. And then beginning in March, the portal actually opened up for certification. So for those who went in and registered, they, beginning in March, could then go in and actually certify that they were compliant with their affirmative action obligations. And that certification deadline is coming up now on June 30th. So, you know, the hope is that if you are a covered contractor, that you are sort of good to go and that you've already certified and done everything. But for those of you who haven't, you know, you want to make sure that you are actually certifying by the June 30th date. So, you know, essentially the process it's relatively easy. We've had some questions from clients with regard to sort of how to go about registering and having some sort of technical issues. There is a pretty good guide and some how-to videos on the OFCCP website that sort of addresses some frequently asked questions and sort of goes through the registration process. So if you are having any trouble and you haven't gone through those, I would highly recommend just going through those. Otherwise, I mean, once you go into the certification process, it's essentially going to just be a certification. You're not going to be asked to submit your affirmative action plan to the OFCCP, at least not yet. That time may come, but as of yet, it's just a certification. And essentially, you're going to have to certify as to one of three categories. So either you are an entity that has developed and maintained an affirmative action program at each of your establishments, if applicable, or that you're an entity that has been party to a qualifying federal contract or subcontract for 120 days or more and has not developed and maintained an affirmative action program at each establishment, or that you have become a federal contractor or subcontractor within the past 120 days, and therefore you have not yet developed your affirmative action program. So for those of you who may not know, under the regulations, if you are a newly awarded federal contractor, you have 120 days from the date of award to develop your AAP, assuming that you have the 50 plus employees and the $50,000 or more in contract value. So if you are new in that regard, then you do have 120 days and you have the option, if that applies to you, to go into the portal and certify accordingly. Otherwise, the two other options are, yes, I have my AAP, or no, I don't have an AAP. So essentially, you know, you want to go through and ensure that you are certifying properly. And again, if you are new, that there is the option to specifically say that you are new and that you are within sort of that 120-day grace period to, excuse me, develop your AAP. With regard to the verification requirement, sort of gone through this a little bit. It is worth noting that the OFCCP will, or was at this point, supposed to send emails to contractors that it has email information for them to register. I mean, that's if you know, the OFCCP has that data on the contractor, then they would more likely than not be sending specific targeted emails reminding contractors of their obligation to register. Otherwise, as we discussed, you essentially go into the website, register. You'll need your employer identification number, right? Your EO1 headquarter company number, and or your establishment or unit number. If you don't know your EO1 identifier, there is an option to go through without that specific information. You would just need to click on not known identifier, and there's a specific section actually in the user guide, as well as a specific how-to video that addresses that. So we actually just got this question from a client recently. The EO1 number is based off of your 2018 EO1 report. So if you have, and if you filed a 2018 EO1 report, then that's the number that you are using. If you didn't file or don't have a 2018 EO1 report, then you can go ahead and move forward with the process with that sort of not known identifier protocol, and then also just enter in your identification number, legal business name, and a few other data elements, and you should be good to go. It'll probably require you to manually enter your company information, whereas if you had your EO1 report, then it would just automatically populate based on what was submitted previously, obviously. But you can still obviously go through the process if you didn't have that information or didn't file. Again, just to reiterate, because we are coming up on this deadline, you have until June 30th to submit. So that is in what, about a little more than 2 weeks here. So again, if you haven't done it yet, I would highly encourage you to do it. And lastly, just a quick note, this is only applicable to supply and service contractors only, right? So if you are a construction contractor, you do not need to go through the certification process. And that is because construction contractors actually don't have a specific AAP obligation. There's sort of a list of 16 steps and affirmative action steps, they call it, that construction contractors are required to take. So this sort of registration process and subsequent certification process is only applicable to supply and service contractors only. So for any construction contractors out there, you can breathe a sigh of relief for now because you don't have to do this. Just a quick, I'm not going to kind of spend any more than probably a couple minutes on this, but I do want to talk a little bit about sort of AAPs generally. We've had quite a few clients come to us, obviously, with this new certification requirement, frantically saying, oh my gosh, we don't have an AAP ready to go. What is an AAP? What do I need to do? And what sorts of information do I need? So really quickly, an AAP, again, is the employer's, the contractor's affirmative action program. So it essentially is a narrative of the affirmative action steps, goals, and processes that the contractor has taken in the prior year. And then sort of also identifying areas of improvement, right? So I always tell clients, it's not that the OFCCP is necessarily looking for all these things that you may be doing wrong. Rather, what the OFCCP is looking for is progress, right? So they want to see that if you are not meeting a certain goal, or if you're not meeting objectives or goals that you had set from the prior year, are you at least making effort towards progressing in that goal, right? So if you had a perfect AAP, if you had, statistics that just looked sort of way too perfect, I mean, that's going to signal to the OFCCP that something might not be necessarily right there, right? So it's okay to have identifiers. It's okay to have areas of a concern and sort of noting things that, you might need to hire more women, or you might need to hire more minorities, right? It's okay to sort of acknowledge those things. It's better that you show progress in sort of making efforts to improve on those areas, rather than showing a picture perfect AAP, because it's more likely than not that something's not necessarily right if it's perfect. So essentially, and the AAP is based on usually your calendar year. So a lot of contractors may choose a different sort of year snapshot. But for most contractors, the easiest way to do it is just the calendar year. So Jan 1 to December 31st of the, whatever the year is. And you're just going to be collecting certain information and conducting various analyses for the different components of the AAP. And then obviously that analysis will help you measure your progress toward equal employment and affirmative action obligations, right? So on the next slide, I think we talk a little bit about the various data components and basics. So we talked about the plan year, types of AAP, so that's sort of important. So either you can have an establishment-based AAP, which is the most popular and frequently used type and developed type of AAP. But for various companies that have, different sort of sites or locations in addition to like a main headquarter location, you can certainly have separate AAPs, especially if you have 50 or fewer at that site, or you can include those employees within the AAP that covers the location of sort of where all the personnel activity takes place. So if the hiring, for example, decisions take place at the headquarter establishment, then you can sort of loop in those employees at that site in, Montana into your headquarter location in Virginia, for example, right? So long as you can show that there is a centralized, location that handles and processes all of the hiring and then personnel function, firing, whatever it is, then you can certainly sort of bring in those employees into that other AAP, or you can have separate AAPs. That obviously is a little bit more work to develop a separate AAP, especially if you have a lot of different sites and locations, but you can certainly do that and you have the option to do that. And then there's also functional-based AAPs that are specific to distinct business units within the company. And these you would actually need to get prior agreement with the OFCCP to actually develop based on functional-based AAP. So this is something a little bit separate and apart and requires a little bit more work, as it actually requires you to reach an agreement with the AAP to do that. But the most common we see is the establishment-based and that single location. So the AAP components, you have your Executive Order 11246 AAP, that's going to be sort of the main quote-unquote AAP. And then if VEVRAA and Section 503 apply to you, VEVRAA will require you to establish a benchmark for hiring. And there's different methods of establishing that benchmark. You can either use just the national percentage that's updated annually. It currently sits at 5.6%. Or you can develop your own individualized hiring benchmark. The reason sort of why I wanted to highlight this is, I wanted to sort of stress the requirement that if you are subject to VEVRAA and 503, there is a separate AAP that you need to develop for each of those laws. And then also understanding that there are sort of these benchmarks or that the OFCCP establishes that you're supposed to essentially aim to meet with regard to your hiring. So if you'll see on the next slide with regard to Section 503, under Section 503, the OFCCP has established a utilization goal of 7%. So that's something that you want to keep in mind. So the 5.6% benchmark hiring goal, or I shouldn't say goal, but sort of the benchmark for VEVRAA with regard to your hiring of protected veterans, and then the 7% utilization goal for the Section 503 individuals with disabilities. So, something that you want to keep in mind. Another thing that you want to make sure of under Section 503 is that you're inviting employees to self-identify at the time of hire, and then at least one time every 5 years thereafter. So we see a lot of contractors failing to do the self-ID forms, but it is a requirement if you're subject to 503. So you want to be sure that you're using that. And there is an OMB approved form that you need to be using. So you want to make sure that you're using that exact form. Okay. So that was the AAP verification requirement. So obviously, again, you have until the end of June to ensure that you are certifying if it's applicable to you. And then, obviously there are various choices and options for how you certify. So you just want to make sure that you are certifying correctly. The next sort of big development that came from the OFCCP so far this year is the quote unquote pay equity directive. So on March 15th this year, the OFCCP issued a directive that sort of makes clear that contractors are required to analyze their compensation practices every year, and they are required to identify and correct any pay disparities based on gender, race, or ethnicity. So something to sort of, I should sort of mention before going into these various directives is the OFCCP issues these quote unquote directives, right? They're called directives for a reason. So they are essentially guidance, right, that the OFCC provides to its staff and to the contractor community on how they're going to be enforcing certain rules and obligations and how they expect contractors to comply. Directives do not change laws or change any of the three, the three laws that set out the affirmative action obligations, and they don't have the force and effect of law. The directives are merely directives. So they essentially just set in stone what the OFCCP policy and practices are, and then what contractors should look carefully to as set out in these directives. So, it's kind of interesting because we'll see the OFCCP issue all of these directives. We saw a ton of directives that came out of, the prior administration, but now we're starting to see directives that rescind prior directives. So that's something to keep in mind. Obviously, you want to make sure that you are, following the guidance provided by the OFCCP because that's sort of how they're going to be training their compliance officers to conduct themselves and to focus on certain things, during an audit, for example. So it sort of gives you the ability to sort of predict the types of things that the OFCCP will focus on. But again, they do not have the force and effect of law, and they don't change any laws or affirmative action regulations. So something to keep in mind here. So with regard to this specific directive, this was the first that the OFCCP issued this year. And essentially, the stated purpose of the directive was to provide guidance on how the OFCCP will evaluate federal contractors' compliance with pay equity audit obligations, and also clarify their authority to access and review pay equity audits. So, obviously, contractors have long been required to conduct reviews of compensation practices, right? This is pretty set in affirmative action regulations that you're supposed to evaluate your compensation systems, and the contractor, if you are subject to an audit, as part of that scheduling letter, there is that item 19, right? So on that itemized listing that directs you on sort of what sorts of information you're required to submit during an audit. Item 19 specifically asks contractors to provide detailed employee compensation data, right? So that's not changed. That's always sort of been there. What is different now is that the OFCCP is now sort of underscoring the agency's ability to review the contractor's pay equity audit conducted, and that they are now also able to request that the contractor provide a complete copy of the pay equity audit or audits that they conducted, showing all, how they evaluated various pay groupings, what sort of factors they use, what controls they use, and the results of that analyses, right? This is pretty significant because there always used to be sort of this period of time before this directive came into place where contractors would retain counsel to help with preparation of a pay audit, and then you could sort of protect that pay audit under the attorney-client privilege, right? What the OFCCP is now saying is that while they recognize that contractors can often retain counsel to sort of assist with the preparation of that audit, that contractors are still required to maintain and make available to the agency documentation of their compliance, right? So that they are no longer able to invoke attorney-client privilege or the attorney work product doctrine, which protects that confidential, attorney-client work for the pay audit. So any pay equity audits that are being done to comply with the OFCCP regulations are no longer, or you cannot use the attorney-client privilege for. However, nothing prevents a contractor from conducting a proactive preliminary analysis with an attorney for the sole purpose of obtaining legal advice, which the directive makes clear can still remain privileged. So again, just to sort of make clear, for those pay equity audits that you're conducting for the sole purpose of obtaining legal advice, doing it on a proactive basis, doing sort of a preliminary analysis with an attorney, those can still remain privileged, and those are continue to be, and you'll hear attorneys sort of stress the importance of doing those, because not only are you protecting those sorts of audits and analyses that you can then take that legal advice to apply to your annually conducted pay equity audit that you're supposed to do under the law and that you're required to turn over to the OFCCP, but you're able to also obtain legal advice about things that you may need to either fix or sort of identify or work with when you are in fact conducting those pay equity audits. So again, all this to say, this directive obviously makes clear that compensation discrimination and pay equity is going to be a monumental and very, very important and significant objective to come from the OFCCP, obviously by requiring contractors to turn those in and sort of removing that very broad attorney-client privilege that could have been invoked overall. That's obviously stressing the significance of how the agency is viewing compensation discrimination. So just take note of that. Obviously, if there is a need to conduct a proactive or sort of a preliminary analysis with legal counsel to understand where some areas of concern may be, then that can certainly be done, and that can be done under the attorney-client privilege, and you can obtain legal advice freely with regard to that. But otherwise, outside of that, the OFCCP is able to now obtain copies of pay equity audits if they are done solely for the purpose of compliance with the regulations. Just looking at my questions here, I know I'm kind of haven't really been doing that. I see one question here. You mentioned VEVRAA should be a separate AAP. We currently pull in those requirements into our main AAP. Can it be folded in, or does it have to be separate? You can certainly, I mean, sort of how you format it is up to you. You just want to make clear that all of that data and all of that collection is done separately. I would encourage and recommend that that data be pulled into a separate sort of specific VEVRAA focused AAP that goes through the specific requirements that are required, because there is sort of other data elements, for example, providing hiring numbers for the past 3 years and sort of doing a lot of that specific data collection. So if possible, I would recommend that you pull into a separate AAP. Next development here is the proposed revision of the 2020 predetermination notice rule. So a week after they issued the pay equity directive, the OFCCP issued a proposed rule to make it easier for the agency to issue predetermination notices. So again, this is something that the OFCCP had issued late in 2020. They had issued this predetermination notice rule that essentially sort of set in stone and codified their processes and legal standards for how they would adjudicate discrimination and how they would move forward with litigation if it came to that. They essentially noted that the OFCCP is able to escalate an audit to the next stage and sort of set out the processes and protocols for doing that. It required the OFCCP to disclose to the contractor its statistical methods for arriving at its conclusion. So, which was sort of very helpful, because that way you could understand sort of how the OFCCP got to the conclusion they did, and could compare how they calculated based on the statistics that they use versus, how you as a contractor were calculating certain things. And then also required the OFCCP in a lot of cases to not rely on statistical evidence alone in finding potential discrimination. So, pretty clear and concise legal standards and processes that were established, should an audit then take the next step and proceed to a litigation or lawsuit level. What the OFCCP now did on March 22nd of this year was largely rescind that rule. So essentially, they are now sort of making it harder for the contractors to obtain transparency on how the OFCCP has come to the conclusion that it has, right? So the requirement that the OFCCP needed to disclose its statistical data is no longer required, or the requirement to rely on more than statistics in finding potential discrimination is no longer a requirement, right? So is no longer required, rather. So essentially, it seems to be giving the agency more sort of flexibility in how they're handling these things legally and procedurally. But it's certainly not making it easier for the contractors who were sort of able to understand from that prior 2020 rule, maybe a little bit more about how the OFCCP got to the conclusion that they did, and then able to better prepare themselves, when facing litigation. But now that is obviously pending revision and then pending rescission, and that's going to change, and it's going to make it a lot harder for the contractors who are facing these types of cases to understand how the OFCCP derived their conclusion and to properly defend against it. It also actually made a small adjustment regarding the response deadline to a predetermination notice. So it used to be where if you received a PDN or a predetermination notice, that essentially was your notice that the OFCCP found some indicators and found some potential areas of discrimination, you had 30 days to then respond to that PDN, but now that time is being decreased from 30 to 15. So essentially that time period is cut in half, and contractors are now given less time to respond to a potentially big deal here. So again, just another reflection of how the OFCCP is changing its tune from a sort of more transparent, more flexible, more sort of reliable agency to one that's really focused on ensuring enforcement and really making it probably more difficult for contractors to properly defend against any issues that may come up. And lastly, the next directive that came out of the OFCCP, and the second one that came this year, was the Effective Compliance Evaluations and Enforcement Directive that came on March 31st of this year. So a lot of activity in March, clearly. So all of this happened during that month, and I think the OFCCP is probably really busy with the AAP contractor portal and ensuring that they get contractors kind of set on that. But we probably believe we'll see a lot more activity in the latter half of this year. But this directive essentially sort of highlights the more aggressive stance that the OFCCP is taking with regard to enforcement, right? So compliance evaluations, and we'll talk a little bit more about it on the next slide, are essentially the sort of various audits that a contractor can face from the OFCCP. So what this directive essentially does, it repeals 4 Trump-era directives that altogether had sort of given contractors more notice of OFCCP investigations, more transparency in how the agency conducts its audits, and also how they close out their audits, right? So they were sort of the foundational directives issued under the Craig Lean leadership, the prior leadership of the OFCCP, that sort of focused on these pillars of transparency and efficiency and certainty, and were sort of highly appreciated and acknowledged by the contractor community, but no more, right? So this new directive actually essentially replaces those 4 directives with a sort of new protocol that makes it much harder for contractors to go through these audits and go through these compliance evaluations. So among other things, it repeals an automatic 30-day extension for audited contractors to produce whatever data was initially requested. So we would get a lot of clients come to us with scheduling letters and obviously needing help in how to put everything together and the types of information and documents to pull. And we would automatically be able to get a 30-day extension just to give us more time to respond, or if we're not involved, for the contractor to respond. That no longer is applicable. Now that sort of 30-day extension is only afforded to those situations of extraordinary circumstances, so medical absences of key personnel, disaster, deaths, or just, very extraordinary circumstances. So it's going to be a lot harder to request an extension, obviously, among other things. And then it's also eliminating the 45-day lag time between OFCCP's publication of its scheduling list and its auditing of contractors on the list. So it used to be where the OFCCP would issue its scheduling letter online. That would sort of trigger this 45-day notice for contractors to sort of gear up and get ready. And then once they received the scheduling letter, they had 30 days. So it really gave contractors essentially 75 days to get ready for this audit. But now the OFCCP is rescinding that 45-day delay between their agency publishing the scheduling list online and then actual audit of the contractors. So obviously this is, a big deal because it's eliminating sort of much needed time for contractors to pull information that they need, and then also providing less flexibility to the contractor community to be able to properly respond to these audits, and imposing much tighter timelines than probably contractors would want. So, something to look out for is that's certainly going to be a key factor when, audits come around down the line and contractors sort of face these tight deadlines. So. Okay, and just really quickly, just spend a minute or two here on compliance evaluations. So just so for folks who may not know, there are different sort of methods of investigative procedures that the OFCCP takes. They either do this comprehensive, full-on compliance review, or they just do a review of records, right? Just to make sure that you have everything that you are supposed to have and that you're maintaining records for the adequate period of time. Or they conduct focus reviews where they focus on one specific component of the contractor's organization, or one aspect of the contractor's employment practice. So you may be subject to, for example, a Section 503 focus review that focuses primarily on auditing your Section 503 obligations, ensuring that you have appropriate reasonable accommodation policies, that you are properly making dispositions on those reasonable accommodation requests, and so forth. So a compliance evaluation or an audit by the OFCCP can take on a whole different sort of array of form and then what it looks like and what you'd be subject to, but it certainly is a lot whether or not you are subject to one, and also what type you are subject to. Okay, we can probably skip this slide on sort of compliance evaluations. That's just the types of things that they look at. And some best practices here, the one thing I would just focus on here is beyond obviously preparing, you want to just understand the OFCCP, the laws, understand the directives. So obviously we went through the various directives and proposed rules that came out of the OFCCP this year, but to the extent that you can have a point person that is staying updated with what the OFCCP issues, that's obviously going to be important, because that's going to sort of help navigate how to address any audits or questions or things that you may hear from the OFCCP and things that you need to prepare in the event of an audit. And these are just some good things to keep in mind to stay organized. And then probably the one thing that I would point out here is try to do an internal audit annually. So not only with regard to sort of the compliance checklist of items that you need to be auditing and going through, but also that pay equity audit that we talked about. So to the extent that you can pull in an attorney to help with going through a proactive pay equity analysis with you, that way you can sort of get prepared with this heightened compensation discrimination focus that is going to be happening, and we all anticipated it, and it's certainly happening, especially with the issuance of that directive. You want to make sure that that's all set. So beyond obviously preparing your AAP, putting together, data, getting yourself registered and certified for the portal, and doing sort of all of these administrative things, I think there's a lot, that can be said, and a lot of, I guess, help that can come from conducting internal audits on an annual and frequent basis. Because if you can identify problems ahead of time, right, before the OFCCP comes knocking on your door, then you are going to save yourself a lot more time, a lot more hassle, a lot more headache when it comes time to undergoing an OFCCP audit. Because with this new heightened enforcement, with this new era of various directives and the new leadership and the types of things that we're seeing from the OFCCP that we discussed today, we're going to see a much stronger and a much more aggressive agency that is just going to not really be amenable to a lot of, flexibility, or not be very understanding of things. So the more you can prepare and be proactive about these things, the better. And that's all for today. Again, my contact information is on the screen here. We will be sending everyone who attended a follow-up email with a link to the recording with my contact information. Again, I do see that there were a few questions that I missed, and I'm truly, truly sorry, but I will obtain the list of questions, and I will be happy to reach out directly individually to address questions. And for those who didn't have a question today but have any questions that may pop up after the fact, please do not hesitate to reach out. And I hope you guys enjoyed the program. Be on the lookout for those pesky OFCCP auditors, and have a wonderful day.